Chapter 1. Seeds of Betrayal. The sprawling Delacroix estate basked under the muted gold of an autumn sun. Nestled amid the rolling hills of the countryside, the mansion's stone facade glimmered faintly, a stoic sentinel over the family secrets it had housed for generations. A line of sleek, black cars stood like silent mourners along the gravel driveway, their polished exteriors reflecting the somber occasion. Inside the estate's grand hall, guests murmured in hushed tones, their voices muffled by the heavy tapestries that lined the walls. Isabelle Delacroix stood at the edge of the room, clutching a delicate lace handkerchief in her gloved hands. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her black dress hugged her figure with a restraint that mirrored her carefully composed expression. She glanced sideways at her husband, Liam, who stood a few steps away, shoulders hunched in quiet grief. Liam's soft features betrayed his unease, his blue eyes darting between family members gathered in clusters. Isabel noted how he seemed smaller here, his usual warmth and charm dimmed under the weight of the moment. Across the room, Nathaniel Delacroix, the elder son, radiated effortless confidence. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, he spoke to a group of relatives, his deep voice carrying a resonance that turned heads. Isabel felt the pull of his presence like a moth to a flame. It wasn't just his striking features or the way he commanded attention, it was the promise of something more. Power, influence, in the kind of security she had craved her entire life. Her gaze lingered on him a second too long, and when their eyes met, a flicker of understanding passed between them. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks, masked only by the rouge carefully applied earlier. "Isabel," Liam's voice startled her from her reverie. "Yes, darling?" she replied smoothly, her lips curving into a practiced smile. "Are you all right?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "You've been awfully quiet." "Just paying my respects," she said, her tone tinged with solemnity. "It's a lot to take in." Liam nodded, his hand brushing hers briefly. She resisted the urge to pull away, aware of the eyes on them. Their marriage, she reminded herself, was part of the intricate web she had woven. But Liam's tenderness felt like a chain, holding her back from the world she truly desired, a world Nathaniel seemed to inhabit so effortlessly. As the family gathered in the library for the reading of Victor Delacroix's preliminary instructions, the tension was palpable. The room was a masterpiece of old-world charm, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a fireplace framed by intricately carved stone. The air smelled faintly of aged leather and tobacco, remnants of the patriarch's presence. Nathaniel took a seat at the head of the long oak table, his commanding posture a natural fit. Isabel noted the way his fingers drummed lightly against the polished wood, a gesture that hinted at his restlessness. Liam sat beside her, his hand resting on her knee as though to ground her. The touch felt intrusive. Gerald Whitman, the family lawyer, cleared his throat and began. "As you all know, Victor Delacroix was meticulous in his affairs. Before we proceed with the full reading of his will, there are matters requiring resolution." A murmur spread through the room. Isabel exchanged a glance with Nathaniel, her curiosity piqued. "We are awaiting documentation from the late Mrs. Delacroix's estate," Gerald continued. "Until then, the official reading will be postponed." "Postponed?" Isabel's voice cut through the air, sharper than she intended. She quickly softened her tone. "Forgive me, Mr. Whitman, but is there no way to expedite this process?" Gerald adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "The matter is sensitive. I assure you everything will be handled in due course." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into a faint smirk. "Patience, Isabel," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Good things come to those who wait." Her chest tightened at his words, laced with both amusement and something darker. It was a game, she realized, a dangerous one. Yet she was drawn to it, to him, with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. That evening, as the guests departed, Isabel found herself alone in the garden. The estate's manicured hedges and blooming roses formed a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside her. She heard footsteps approach and turned to see Nathaniel, his silhouette framed by the glow of the mansion's lights. "You seem troubled," he said, his tone teasing, but his gaze probing. "And you seem far too pleased with yourself," she shot back, though her lips betrayed a smile. Nathaniel stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the cool night air. "You're an enigma, Isabel," he said, his voice a mix of curiosity and challenge. "What is it you truly want?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Isabel held his gaze, the line between ambition and desire blurring. "What we both want," she replied finally, her voice barely a whisper, "to claim what's ours." Chapter 2. Shadows in the Mirror. The days following the funeral were steeped in an oppressive stillness, as if the Delacroix estate itself had slipped into mourning. Isabel moved through its grand halls with an air of practiced grace, her every step a calculated performance for the staff and family members who observed her. Beneath her calm exterior, however, her thoughts were anything but serene. The delayed reading of the will gnawed at her, the unknown details of Victor Delacroix's fortune looming like an unseen predator. Liam, ever the doting husband, seemed oblivious to her inner turmoil. He spent his days tending to the estate's affairs, dutifully reviewing paperwork, and coordinating with the staff to ensure everything ran smoothly. Isabel admired his diligence in a detached sort of way, though she often wondered how such an unassuming man had survived in the Delacroix family's cutthroat world. One evening, as Liam worked late in the study, Isabel made her way to the west wing of the estate, where Nathaniel's rooms were located. Her footsteps echoed faintly against the marble floor, the sound swallowed by the towering ceilings. She felt a rush of adrenaline as she approached his door, the thrill of transgression a heady mix with her anticipation. Nathaniel opened the door before she could knock, as if he'd sensed her approach. He stood in the doorway, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his dark hair tousled. The flickering light from the fireplace behind him cast sharp shadows across his angular features. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "I wanted to talk," Isabel replied, her voice low. "Somewhere private." Nathaniel stepped aside, allowing her to enter. His room was a stark contrast to Liam's. Minimalist, almost cold, with little decoration beyond a few framed photographs and a leather armchair near the hearth. Isabel moved toward the window, her arms crossed as she gazed out at the estate's gardens, now shrouded in darkness. "What's on your mind?" Nathaniel asked, closing the door behind him. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "The will, the delay, it's unsettling. I can't help but feel there's something we're not being told." Nathaniel leaned against the mantel, studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "You're not wrong," he said after a moment. "There's something Victor wanted to keep hidden, something he didn't want us to know." "Do you think it has to do with Margaret's will?" Isabel asked, her voice tinged with urgency. Nathaniel shrugged, though his jaw tightened. "Possibly. My father was nothing if not thorough. If he delayed this reading, it was for a reason." Their eyes met, and for a moment the weight of their shared ambition hung between them, like an unspoken vow. Isabel took a step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "If we worked together, we could—" The sound of footsteps in the hall made her freeze. Nathaniel's expression shifted instantly, his cool demeanor replaced with alarm. Isabel moved quickly, ducking behind the heavy velvet drapes by the window as the door creaked open. "Nathaniel!" Liam's voice broke the silence, tentative and soft. Nathaniel straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "What is it, Liam?" "I thought I heard voices," Liam said, stepping into the room. His eyes scanned the space, lingering briefly on the drawn curtains before returning to his brother. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't," Nathaniel replied smoothly. "Just going over some paperwork." Liam nodded, though his gaze remained uncertain. "I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to help with the estate accounts tomorrow. There's a lot to get through, and I could use your insight." "Of course," Nathaniel said, his tone cordial. "First thing in the morning." Satisfied, Liam turned to leave. Isabel held her breath as the door clicked shut, her heart pounding. She stepped out from behind the curtains, her cheeks flushed. "That was close," she murmured, her voice unsteady. Nathaniel regarded her with a mixture of amusement and reproach. "You need to be more careful," he said. "Liam's not as blind as you think." Isabel bristled at his tone, but said nothing. She left his room moments later, her mind racing with the implications of their conversation. Liam's unexpected appearance had been a stark reminder of the precariousness of her position. She would have to tread more carefully if she wanted to secure her place in the Delacroix legacy. The following week brought a series of subtle but significant changes. Liam, perhaps spurred by some unspoken suspicion, began paying closer attention to Isabel's movements. She caught him watching her more often, his gaze lingering just a little too long. He asked her questions he hadn't asked before, about her time in town, her conversations with Nathaniel, her thoughts on the estate. Isabel answered him with practiced ease, but the scrutiny unnerved her. One evening, as he worked late in the study, she took the opportunity to search his desk. Her fingers sifted through stacks of papers and ledgers, her pulse quickening when she found a small notebook tucked beneath a pile of correspondence. The notebook was filled with Liam's neat handwriting, its pages detailing his observations and suspicions. Phrases like late-night absences and conversations with Nathaniel leapt out at her, each one a dagger of accusation. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the extent of his vigilance. Closing the notebook, she returned it to its hiding place and hurried back to her room. The walls of her carefully constructed life were closing in, and she would have to act quickly if she hoped to stay ahead of the unraveling threads. Chapter 3. The cracks widen. Liam could no longer ignore the unease growing in his chest. The Delacroix estate, with all its grandeur and history, had begun to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a labyrinth of secrets. His discovery of Isabel's cryptic messages to Nathaniel had been the final blow to his carefully maintained trust. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he chose to gather more information. If he were to confront his wife and brother, he would need proof. Late one evening, when the rest of the household had retired, Liam slipped into Isabel's room. He moved carefully, his heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and resolve. Her desk was meticulously organized, a reflection of her polished exterior, but Liam had learned to look beneath appearances. Beneath a false bottom in one of the drawers, he found a small stack of papers, letters exchanged between Isabel and Nathaniel. The words burned into his mind. Phrases like, "It's only a matter of time," and "We must be patient, but the fortune will be ours," revealed the extent of their collusion. Yet there were other notes that disturbed him more deeply, intimate exchanges that hinted at a relationship far beyond mere scheming. Liam's hands trembled as he returned the papers to their hiding place, his mind a whirlwind of betrayal and confusion. The tension in the household reached new heights as the day of the will reading finally arrived. The family gathered in the drawing room, a sprawling space adorned with heavy drapes and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them. Gerald Whitman, the family lawyer, stood at the head of the room with a leather-bound portfolio in hand. He cleared his throat, his expression grave. "Thank you all for gathering. As you know, Victor Delacroix's will was to be read immediately following his passing. However, certain legal matters required clarification, which is why we delayed this session. Today we will address not only Victor's will, but also a second document, Margaret Delacroix's will, which she entrusted to me before her passing." The room erupted into murmurs. Isabel exchanged a wary glance with Nathaniel, while Liam's eyes remained fixed on Gerald. "Why was Margaret's will kept hidden until now?" Nathaniel asked, his tone edged with suspicion. Gerald hesitated before answering. "Margaret instructed me to keep it confidential until Victor's passing. She believed it contained matters too sensitive to be addressed during his lifetime." Nathaniel frowned but said no more. Isabel leaned forward in her chair, her fingers gripping the armrest. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Gerald began reading Victor's will. Victor's will was what most had expected, a detailed account of his assets and their division. The Delacroix estate and its businesses were to remain in the family's control, split between Nathaniel and Liam, with specific provisions for the staff and charitable donations. As Gerald read on, however, his tone shifted. "Now we turn to Margaret Delacroix's will," he announced, his voice steady but tinged with gravity. He opened a second folder and began. "Margaret left behind a letter addressed to her family, which I have been instructed to read aloud." The room fell silent. Gerald unfolded a single sheet of paper and began to read. "To my beloved family, if you are hearing this, it means that Victor has passed, and with him, the secrets we carried together. It is time for the truth to be known, however painful it may be. Years ago, I made a terrible mistake. An affair with a dear friend, one born of loneliness and a moment of weakness, resulted in 2 children. To protect our family, Victor and I decided that one child would be raised as our own, while the other was adopted out in secrecy. This decision has haunted me every day of my life." Gasps filled the room. Nathaniel's face went pale and Isabel's breath caught in her throat. Gerald continued, "The child we raised as our own is Nathaniel. The child who was adopted is Isabel." The room erupted into chaos. Isabel sat frozen, her mind struggling to process the revelation. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she glanced at Nathaniel, who had risen from his chair, his face a mask of disbelief. Liam's gaze darted between the two of them, his expression a mixture of shock and anguish. "This can't be true," Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible. "It is," Gerald said, his tone heavy. "I have the documentation to prove it." Nathaniel's fists clenched at his sides. "You're telling me Isabel is my half-sister?" "Yes," Gerald replied. "Margaret wanted this truth to be known, no matter how painful. She believed that only by confronting the past could the family move forward." Isabel shot to her feet, her chair toppling backward. "Why now? Why would she let us live a lie for so long?" "She wanted to protect you," Gerald said, "but she also believed that the truth would set you free." The room descended into silence. Isabel's mind reeled with the implications. Not only had her relationship with Nathaniel been forbidden, but her entire marriage to Liam was now tainted by the revelation of her true parentage. Liam broke the silence. "How long have you known?" His voice was hoarse, directed at Isabel and Nathaniel. "We didn't," Nathaniel said, his voice hollow. "Not until now." Isabel opened her mouth to speak, but found no words. Liam's eyes locked on hers, filled with pain and betrayal. "You lied to me," he said, his voice trembling. "Even if you didn't know the truth about your parentage, you lied about everything else. How much of our life together was real?" I didn't know," Isabel stammered. "I didn't know about this. About any of it." Nathaniel turned away, his shoulders slumping as he stared at the floor. Isabel stood frozen, the walls of her carefully constructed life crumbling around her. For the first time in years, she felt utterly powerless. Chapter 4. The Spiral of Guilt. The Delacroix estate, usually alive with whispers of staff and the hum of daily life, now stood in suffocating silence. The shock of the matriarch's revelation hung like a storm cloud, and each member of the family retreated to their corners of the sprawling mansion, consumed by their thoughts. Nathaniel locked himself in his study, the once prized collection of books and artifacts now a mockery of the Delacroix legacy he had aspired to inherit. He stared at his reflection in the ornate mirror above the fireplace, the lines of his face harsher under the dim light. For years, he had prided himself on being the family's golden child, the heir, the leader, the one who bore the weight of their name with pride. And yet in a single moment, he was reduced to a lie. He was not Victor Delacroix's son, not the rightful heir. Worse, he was the half-brother of the woman with whom he had shared a forbidden passion. Nathaniel poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid trembling in his hand. Each sip burned more than the last, but it couldn't numb the disgust coiling in his chest. Isabel's image haunted him, her smile, her touch, the promises they'd made in whispers. He slammed the glass down, shattering it against the mahogany desk. "What have I done?" he muttered, his voice cracking. Across the estate, Isabel paced her bedroom. Her elegant heels clicked against the hardwood floor, an ironic echo of the confidence she no longer felt. The truth of her origins was a wound too deep to fathom. Her entire life, a relentless climb from poverty to prestige, was now stained with shame. She opened her closet, pulling out an ornate box where she kept her most valuable possessions. Inside lay a necklace, a gift from Liam on their first anniversary. She held it in her hands, her tears falling into the delicate gold chain. How had she come to this? A life built on lies, an identity stolen, and a love twisted beyond recognition. Liam's words replayed in her mind. How much of our life together was real? She had no answer. Not for him, not for herself. The knock on the door startled her. It was Liam, his face pale but resolute. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice soft. She hesitated before nodding. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his eyes scanning her face. "No more lies. No more evasion. I need to understand." Isabel sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly. "I don't know where to start." "Start with the truth," Liam said, his tone steady despite the pain in his eyes. "Why Nathaniel? Why risk everything?" Her voice wavered as she spoke. I thought he was my way to security, power. I thought I loved him. But it wasn't love, Liam. It was desperation. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know this." Liam's expression softened, but his hurt remained palpable. "And me? Was I just a stepping stone?" She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "You were the only real thing in my life. I didn't see it then, but I do now. You loved me for who I was, not for what I could give you, and Her voice broke. "I threw it away." Liam knelt in front of her, his hands resting on hers. "Isabel, this isn't just about us. It's about the family, about Nathaniel. We can't pretend this didn't happen." She nodded, her tears falling freely. "I'll leave if that's what it takes." "I'll go, Liam." His grip tightened. "Not yet. We need to face this together. At least for now." The next morning, the family lawyer, Gerald Whitman, summoned the remaining members to the library. Nathaniel arrived late, his disheveled appearance betraying the weight of the revelations. Isabel avoided his gaze, while Liam stood stiffly by the window, his back turned to the room. Gerald cleared his throat, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "There are legal implications to Margaret's will that we must address. The inheritance, as stated, is to be split equally among her children, Nathaniel, Isabel, and Liam." Nathaniel scoffed, his voice bitter. "Inheritance? What inheritance? This is blood money from a family built on lies." Gerald's expression remained neutral. "Be that as it may, the will is binding. Unless contested, the estate and assets will be divided accordingly." "What about the scandal?" Isabel asked, her voice trembling. "If this gets out—" "Margaret included a clause for privacy," Gerald interrupted. "The details of her will are confidential. The choice to make this public rests with you." Nathaniel leaned forward, his eyes dark and piercing. "What would you have us do, Gerald? Smile for the cameras while the world discovers our family's dirty laundry?" Liam, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Enough!" His voice was calm but firm. "This family has already suffered enough. We need to focus on rebuilding, not tearing each other apart." Nathaniel met his brother's gaze, his expression softening. For the first time, he saw the strength Liam had always carried, overshadowed by the chaos Nathaniel himself had created. That evening, Liam found Isabel in the garden, standing by the ancient oak tree that had been a cornerstone of the estate for generations. She seemed small, fragile against the sprawling backdrop. "Isabel," he began, his voice steady, "I've made a decision." She turned to him, her face pale in the moonlight. "What is it?" "You'll stay until the legal matters are resolved," he said. "But after that, I think it's best if you leave. Not because I hate you, God knows I don't, but because this place, this family, It's too much for both of us. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. I understand. And Isabel, he added, his voice softening, find yourself again. Not the woman who needs wealth or power, just you. She nodded again, her tears falling silently. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The Delacroix estate had never felt so cold. The grandeur of the mansion now a hollow reminder of the family's fractured ties. The sprawling grounds, once a symbol of wealth and prestige, now seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if the world itself had distanced itself from the family's tangled web of secrets. Nathaniel spent his days wandering the vast estate in a haze. The sprawling grounds offered little comfort. Each step he took only reminded him of the life he had lost, the life he had built on lies. The air, once fresh and invigorating, now felt suffocating, like the walls of the mansion had inched closer with every passing hour. He found himself by the lake, staring at the dark water that reflected the overcast sky above. It felt fitting. He too was darkened by the truth, his identity now a shattered mirror. How could he continue to stand by the family that had never been his? How could he look at Isabel again without seeing the grotesque truth of their bond? In his mind he heard his father's voice, cold and authoritative, telling him how he was meant to carry on the Delacroix name. But all that seemed like a distant echo now, a relic of a past that had crumbled in a single moment. He had tried to bury his guilt in whiskey, in silence, but it never worked. The overwhelming pressure to perform, to be the man his father wanted him to be, had faded, leaving only emptiness behind. Nathaniel needed to find a way forward, a way to understand who he was outside of the family's expectations. Liam's mornings had become routine. Though far from peaceful, he would rise early, take a walk through the estate's gardens, and attempt to find solace in the solitude. Each time he gazed at the sprawling hedges or the ornate fountain at the center of the grounds, he felt disconnected, both from his family and his own sense of purpose. The decision he had made to allow Isabel to remain in the house was weighing on him. It was an attempt to cling to the last remnants of his former life, to salvage something from the wreckage of their marriage. But every conversation with Isabel felt strained, filled with the unspoken knowledge of her betrayal. Her eyes no longer sparkled with the same warmth. There was nothing between them now but the ghosts of what had been. Despite his pain, Liam had chosen to shield Isabel from the storm that was sure to come, protecting her from the consequences of her actions. He believed it was the right thing to do, but the gnawing feeling that he was enabling her, that he was somehow complicit in her deceit, lingered like an unspeakable burden. The family lawyer had arrived earlier that day to discuss the final steps of the inheritance division. The estate, the wealth, what did it all mean now? Would it make a difference now that the family had unraveled? The truth was, Liam didn't know. He spent the afternoon with Emily Carter, his childhood friend, who had always been his emotional anchor. She was a rare presence in the world of the Delacroix, unassuming, yet steadfast in her loyalty. She had known Liam long before the Delacroix name had meant anything, long before the weight of inheritance had consumed him. You don't have to do this alone, Emily said as they sat on the terrace, the cool breeze tussling her brown hair. You have to stop shouldering this burden, Liam. You're not responsible for the mess they made. Liam looked at her, his heart heavy with the words he couldn't say. But I love her, Emily, and now I don't know how to love her anymore. Emily placed a gentle hand on his. Love doesn't mean you have to accept everything. Sometimes you need to step back, and sometimes that means letting go. Isabel had not yet told Nathaniel that she planned to leave, but the decision had been made in the quiet of her mind. She could not stay, not with the guilt festering in every corner of the estate. It would not be easy to leave the life she had built, but the weight of her past, of her own actions, was too much to bear. The second will had revealed her hidden past, but in truth it was the emotional inheritance of her choices that would prove most difficult to confront. No longer could she pretend to be the woman she had once been, the woman who had convinced herself that power and wealth were the only things worth pursuing. She sat in front of her vanity, staring at her reflection, the image of a woman whose every flaw had been laid bare. She was no longer the clever, beautiful woman who had captured Liam's heart. She was a woman lost in her own deception, trying to find her way back. But where was the path forward? Her hands shook as she reached for the necklace that Liam had given her, the same one she had once clutched in moments of doubt. It felt heavy in her fingers, a symbol of a life now lost. A tear slipped from her eye and she closed the box, turning away from the mirror. Later that evening, as the estate's darkened corridors whispered with tension, Isabel found herself face to face with Nathaniel in the library. The air between them was thick with guilt, yet neither of them could look away from the other. The passion they once shared had turned into a burden, one neither could escape. "I can't stay here anymore," Isabel said, her voice small. "Not with everything that's happened." Nathaniel remained silent, his face unreadable. "You don't think I know that?" His voice was hoarse, a shadow of the man he once was. Isabel's heart twisted at the sight of him, broken, lost. He had once been her partner in crime, but now they were just two people stranded in the wreckage of their choices. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Nathaniel's eyes softened, but the damage was done. "You're not the only one who needs to leave, Isabel. I have my own battles to fight now. I don't know who I am anymore." The weight of his words struck her like a blow. Nathaniel Delacroix, the man who had once been everything, charming, charismatic, the heir, was now a shadow of himself. "You'll figure it out," she said, turning to leave. "We all will." Liam, who had been listening from the doorway, his back pressed against the cool wood, stepped into the room. He had witnessed their exchange, and although his heart ached for Isabel, he knew the time had come to make the hardest decision of all. "Isabel," he began, his voice steady, "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I know we can't keep living like this." Isabel's eyes filled with unshed tears as she turned to face him. Liam placed the decision squarely in her hands. "You have to leave, for both our sakes. It's the only way forward." With that, Isabel nodded, the finality of the moment settling over them like a cold gust of wind. She had no more words, no more excuses. Chapter 6. A New Dawn. The Delacroix estate felt eerily empty in the days that followed Isabel's departure. The silence that had once been filled with the sound of footsteps, laughter, and the rustle of silk now hung heavy in the air, broken only by the occasional flutter of leaves in the wind. The grand halls of the mansion, which had witnessed generations of triumphs and scandals, seemed to mourn the unraveling of yet another chapter in its storied history. Liam wandered through the corridors with a sense of detachment, as if he were observing someone else's life. His world had been upended, and the once comfortable rhythms of family life had become alien to him. The weight of his decision, his choice to protect Isabel, even in her darkest moments, felt both like a burden and a relief. Yet he knew there was no going back. Liam sat alone in the drawing room, his hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey that seemed to offer no solace. He heard the faint click of heels on the marble floor. Nathaniel. The elder brother's presence was a reminder of the family's fractured legacy, the bond they shared forever changed by the revelations of their past. Nathaniel approached with a grim expression, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the family's secrets had settled squarely on them. He had not spoken to Liam much since the shocking revelation about their parentage, and Liam could feel the distance between them like a chasm. "I'm leaving," Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "I've booked a flight to Paris. I need to get away from this place, away from all the lies." Liam didn't respond immediately. He had expected this, but hearing the words out loud made it feel final. The bitterness and resentment that had once been a constant undercurrent between them were now overshadowed by the complexities of their shared history. Neither of them had known the full truth about their lineage until it was too late. They were no longer the sons of Victor Delacroix. They were simply men lost in a web of inheritance neither had asked for. "I understand," Liam said, his voice steady. "I think it's for the best. We all need to figure out who we really are. away from the shadows of this place. Nathaniel nodded slowly, his eyes searching Liam's face. I never wanted to hurt you, you know. But in the end, it was all about the money, the legacy, wasn't it? It always was. And it's strange how quickly it all falls apart when you realize it was never really yours to begin with. The truth of Nathaniel's words stung, but Liam had no retort. He simply nodded, the weight of the years that had been lost between them settling heavily in his chest. Goodbye, Liam, Nathaniel said quietly. I hope you can forgive me one day. Liam watched as Nathaniel turned and walked out of the room, the finality of the moment sinking in. His brother was gone, not physically, but emotionally and mentally. The man who had once been his rival, his protector, and his tormentor was now nothing more than a distant figure. As Liam stood at the window of the mansion, watching Nathaniel disappear into the distance, his thoughts drifted to Isabel. She had left that morning, quietly slipping out of the house without a word, leaving only a letter. Her departure had been a quiet one, perhaps the only way she could leave without further drawing attention to the chaos she had caused. Isabel's letter had been brief, but it was filled with the honesty Liam had longed to hear from her for years. She spoke of regret, of the life she had once dreamed of, and of the crushing weight of the secret she had buried. Most of all, she wrote that she was leaving not just for him or for herself, but for the chance to finally find a way to live without the shadows of the Delacroix legacy hanging over her. I need to find who I am, Liam, she had written. I can no longer be the person I pretended to be. I wish I could have been the wife you deserved. Maybe someday I'll be someone you could be proud of. But I have to leave now, for both our sakes. Liam felt an ache in his chest as he read her words. There was no denying the hurt she had caused him, but there was a strange peace in knowing that she had made the decision to change, to step away from the life that had consumed them both. Paris was a city of reinvention, a place where one could lose themselves among the winding streets and art-laden galleries. Nathaniel had always admired the idea of it, even before he had fully understood its meaning. It was a city where people could go to escape, to start anew, to shed the weight of the past. But Nathaniel found that Paris did not offer the escape he sought. The cobblestone streets that had seemed so romantic now felt like endless mazes of uncertainty. He had come to the city to find clarity, but all he found was confusion. The questions that had plagued him in the Delacroix estate now followed him here. Who was he really? Without the name, without the legacy, who could he become? He spent his days wandering the city, visiting art museums, cafes, and bookstores. It was here among the cluttered shelves of a quaint little bookshop on Rue de Rivoli that he met someone who would change his path. She was a therapist, a woman who seemed to understand the language of loss and grief without a word being spoken. In the quiet of her office, Nathaniel began to unravel the tangled knots of his mind. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to grieve, not just for the loss of his identity, but for the person he had allowed himself to become. The arrogant, self-assured man who had once held all the answers was gone, replaced by someone who was, for the first time, willing to face the truth. Back at the estate, Liam was coming to terms with the choice he had made. It was not a choice he had wanted, but it was one that had to be made. As the days passed, he found himself looking out at the garden that Isabel had once tended with such care. The roses that had once bloomed brightly were now wilting, the bright petals falling away in the autumn air. It was a symbol of what had been and what was now lost. Yet, despite the pain, Liam began to feel a sense of renewal. He would not let the Delacroix name define him. He would not let the twisted legacy of his family be the final chapter of his story. Liam had a quiet strength, one that had been buried beneath the weight of his family's expectations for far too long. Now, in the aftermath of the chaos, he was finally allowing himself to heal. He had learned the power of forgiveness, not just for others, but for himself. He could not change the past, but he could shape the future. With his heart and mind clearer than they had been in years, Liam stood in the center of the garden, watching as the last remnants of the roses floated on the breeze. It was a symbol, he realized, not of the past, but of what was to come. A new beginning, a chance to reclaim what had been lost. The Delacroix legacy would never be the same. The family would carry the scars of betrayal, loss, and redemption for years to come. But as the seasons changed, as the roses bloomed again, and the sun dipped low behind the mountains, there was a sense of hope. In the end, Liam knew that sometimes the most painful truths led to the greatest transformations.